Good evening and welcome to another Parliamentary and Scientific Committee discussion webinar. All very warmly welcome. It's good of you to join us on not our usual night. Normally we're Mondays. Today, obviously, we are Tuesday. This evening we are going to be discussing in conjunction with the British Neuroscience Association, brain gain, how world-leading UK neuroscience research can meet tomorrow's scientorial challenges. And as I said, that's been organised in conjunction with the British Neuroscience Association. And to help us explore this subject, I have a distinguished panel of presenters. We have Tara Jones, who is a personal chair of neurodegeneration, deputy director of the Centre for Discovering Brain Sciences at University Edinburgh, who's going to talk to us about why neuroscience matters. Then we have Matt East, who is head of patient engagement at Links Group, winner of the BNA's Public Engagement of Neuroscience 2020. Who is going to be in discussion with Anne Cook, who is Chief Executive of the British Neuroscience Association. After that, we have Professor Timothy Constantinou, Professor of Bioelectrics at the Imperial College London and Head of Circuits and System Research Group and Bio-Inspired Technology, who will talk to us about how neural interfaces are beginning to impact human health. And following that, I have Professor Mahmood Hussain, Professor of Neurology and Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Oxford, meeting the societal health challenges of the next decade. Each of them is going to have around 10 minutes to us, and I'll try and keep us to time to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. Now, with regards to questions, can I please ask that you use the question and answer function at the bottom of your Zoom panel. It's the easiest place to keep track of who wants to ask a question, etc. So I will repeat that. Please Q&A rather than hands up or you chat, otherwise you'll lose your position in the queue, as it were. And when we do get to questions and answers, basically I will call your name, you will be unmuted and be able to ask your question in person. I think that's probably all I need to say at this point, other than please remain on mute if not contributing, as that will improve the sound quality. Other than that, I very much look forward to hearing what our various panelists have to say. And we're going to start, as I said, with Professor Tara Spire-Jones. Tara, we look forward to hearing from you. 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. I hope you all can hear me okay. Somebody give me a thumbs up if that's all right. Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to speak to you today about why neuroscience matters. So I'm going to kick it off by trying to convince you that neuroscience matters for more than this, but at least these three reasons. The first is neuroscience is really fundamental to understanding what makes us human and what makes us able to do all the wonderful things like think and feel and learn. The second is that neuroscience matters because it is essential. Our field is essential for preventing and treating neurological and psychiatric disorders. And the third thing I'll talk a little bit about is neuroscience is important because it provides societal benefits. So as Steve mentioned, I'm Professor Tara Spires-Jones. I'm BNA President-elect in addition to my other titles. So it's a real pleasure to sort of represent and champion neuroscience for our national association here today. So my first bubble there was what makes us human. Neuroscience is important for understanding how we think, feel, remember, and this is a huge movement. And some of us, some of the geekier among us, like myself, think of this as the final frontier of biology. And it's not just me and the nerd squad, but there are international projects that are aiming to do this. So one I'm showing you here is the European Brain Council came up with their brain mission, the space race of the 21st century to understand, fix, and enhance the brain. The EU also has the very expensive Human Brain Project, €1 billion over a few years to try and understand some of these fundamental questions. The US has a very clever acronym, Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies, or BRAIN, which is another $1 billion project to try and understand the brain and come up with new technologies to look at it. And closer to home, we have the UK Conservative Party's 2019 Dementia Moonshot, the commitment to double research funding for dementia. So this is a big scale. And to understand these really fundamental things about who we are and how our brain works, we have some challenges. And one of them that I like to point out, sorry for taking you back to year one of university, is the scale of the nervous system. So I've got a little cartoon here, but it goes all the way from meters from the top of your head to all the way down to your big toe is the scale, the physical scale of the longest bit of the nervous system. But we go down through systems like your peripheral nervous system and the brain systems. Maps, you have maps of your sensory space and your motor body on your brain. Networks of different brain cells that work together. Individual cells that I'll show you on a couple of slides. The connections between cells, the synapses, which are my favorite bit of the brain. And we go all the way down to the level of molecules, so genes and proteins and RNA. So we're going from meters down to very tiny things like angstroms. And it's a very complex system. Not only is it big, it's complex. So I'm showing you a few pictures here just as a good excuse to show some beautiful brains. A brain here from a side view, you've all seen this. This is sort of a coronal section through this way through a person's brain who died. And you can see the beautiful white matter and gray matter. The gray matter is where the brain cells live. And your brains are remarkable. In your brain, you have about 100 billion neurons. These are the brain cells that form the network. And they talk to each other down through these axonal processes that Ramonika Hall drew so beautifully over 100 years ago. And those little wires that connect different parts of the brain and nervous system are insulated, just like the wires that we have insulating our electric wires. And that insulation is white. That's why the white matter is white, because it's fat. So that's just a fun fact. But you have those 100 billion brain cells, and then they're connected up. So they have these beautiful structures, send messages down axons, and they're connected up at my favorite bit of the nervous system, the synapse, which is the little connection points where the cells talk to each other. And you can see the scale again. So I showed you the meter scale of the whole body. Now I'm showing you, the size of a brain is approximately, a little bit smaller than your head. This is a centimeter scale. And we go down to, this is one of my electron micrographs where the scale bar here is 0.001 millimeters. So these are tiny structures, these connections. You have these 100 billion brain cells. They talk to each other through 100 trillion or so of these synaptic connections. And I like to show this because that in your head, there are more connections in your brain than there are stars in the Milky Way. So there are about 100 billion stars, maybe 300 billion in the Milky Way. You have 100 trillion connections in your brain. So that complexity is one of the reasons we don't yet understand these fundamental things like how we think and learn and remember. So that's the first point, was it's important to understand fundamentally who we are. Second point is nervous system disorders. So neuronal and psychiatric diseases are a large problem for society. Neurological disorders are one of the leading causes of disability globally. We know beyond just neurological disorders like stroke and Alzheimer's disease and ALS, over 1 billion people, that's a big proportion of us, at some point will live with mental health disorders in our lives. And those are all disorders of the nervous system. And I'm showing you a picture here that I just stole from the BBC website. It's statistics from the Office of National Statistics showing you that even in a pandemic year, when COVID was killing an awful lot of us, Alzheimer's and dementia was the second leading cause of death in January and still the first leading cause of death, maybe close to heart disease here by July. So dementia and Alzheimer's vie with heart disease for the leading cause of death in our country right now. And you got to think it's not just people dying from these diseases, but people are living with them and their lives are affected by them greatly. So there are some challenges with curing, treating, and preventing these neurological and psychiatric disorders. One we've already talked about is that amazing complexity of the brain, right? So that makes, we don't even understand how it works in the first place, so understanding how it goes wrong and how to fix it is a challenge. And we admit that, but we're working hard on it. A second problem for us is that we've been chronically underfunded compared to other biomedical fields. I'm sure you won't be surprised to hear a neuroscientist say, give the neuroscientists more money, but I'll provide you some data on the next slide. And finally, we need the best brains from all over the world, the best minds to work on these problems. And we don't always attract the best minds for various reasons. And I'll hope that you can help with that some too. So in terms of the funding, defeating brain and nervous system disorders does require money. And over 100 billion pounds are spent per year in the UK alone on caring for people with neurologic and psychiatric disorders. So they cost money, and to cure them and to do the fundamental research to understand the brain and the nervous system does also cost money. And what I'm showing you here is some data because I'm a dementia scientist, so I know these numbers and familiar with them. So this is just one of the subfields of neuroscience, dementia, from the dementiastatistics.org website. If you look at this, this is the funding for every 10 pound of disease cost. So this is this 100 billion pounds of disease that per year is caused by neurological disorders. But for cancer, you get about £1 in research funding for every 10 pounds that the disease costs. For heart disease, you get about 60p, 70p. For dementia, 8 pence. 8 pence in research funding for every 10 pounds in cost to the social and healthcare systems. So that's a big disparity. But on the upside, on a more hopeful note, research does work, and we know that. And I put this picture here of a COVID vaccine because we are all very proud of my alma mater, University of Oxford, for the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is a wonderful example of science works. But neuroscience also works, neuroscience research. So this is an example I'm showing you here. This little chap, Arthur Morgan, was the first person in England treated with a drug for spinal muscular atrophy, which is a horrible disease. It's a motor neuron disease that's fatal. It is usually in babies and children and affects about 1 in 10,000 people. And research in the about 1990s to 2000s uncovered the genetic cause of this horrible motor neuron disease. And advances more recently in technology have allowed a creation of a treatment that actually fixes the expression of the gene that goes wrong. And these babies like Arthur, who would have died, are now living longer lives and meeting some of the motor milestones like sitting up that they never would have met. So research is very promising and works. Another example in my own field is that research works through being able to help people understand how they can prevent these types of diseases. So dementia is what I work on. We know dementia is caused by a few buckets of things: age, lifestyle factors, and genes. Can't do much about genes. We all hope we're going to age because the alternative is worse. But lifestyle factors is something we can do something about. And we think actually the best evidence is almost 40% of dementias could be prevented by changing modifiable risk factors, doing things that you would expect, like not smoking, exercising, coming to a lecture, good for you all, this is good for your brains, level of education. And the incidence of dementia in first world countries like ours is actually going down. We have more cases of dementia because our population is rising and aging, but your individual chance of developing dementia is going down. We think that's largely because of public health messaging, understanding these risk factors, reducing our cardiovascular burdens. So my final point before I move on because I'm really looking forward to hearing Matt and Anne chat. But my final point that I'll talk about for just a minute or two is the societal benefits of neuroscience. Enhancing knowledge, which is the first point, understanding who we are is something we've talked about. Also the UK science reputation. We have a great reputation for neuroscience in the UK. It's really strong. We hope, like we've been talking about just now, that we're going to be reducing the disease burden of these really difficult neurological and psychiatric disorders. And finally, we are trying to keep the UK at the real forefront of cutting edge research. So these are some neurons from my lab, some little human neurons grown in a dish, reprogrammed from human blood cells. And to get this high societal benefit, especially this cutting edge research, requires a real interdisciplinary and multimodal type of research. So in neuroscience, it's not like one specific field with one technique. We span the gamut, not just of the meters to angstroms, but of different fields. So we go from molecular and cellular research, like I showed you those neurons on the last slide. We have animal research, computational modeling, human research, clinical trials, and all of these are needed to get towards these treatments, cures, and societal benefits. And not only that, but we also have huge numbers of really cutting edge techniques. And I've put a few of the bubbles over here, some you might have heard of, like CRISPR gene editing, neural interfaces that we'll hear about a little bit later, AI, which is a big up and coming thing, omics. So lots of exciting work going on, and that really keeps us at the forefront of research. So one example of this keeping the UK at the forefront of scientific and medical advances is one I'll talk about here. We're going to hear already about neurotechnology from Matt and a little bit from Tim as well, but I'll talk about artificial intelligence for about 30 seconds here. And again, forgive all the dementia references, but this is what I know. So neuroscience is not just dementia, but what we have here is an example of artificial intelligence, or AI, being used with neuroscience research to really help people now. So the UK Dementia Research Institute at Imperial College London, our Care and Technology Centre, has developed a hugely advanced home monitoring system. So people and their families who are living with dementia have multiple sensors in their houses, wearable sensors, sensors on their kettle, which is the most British sensor I've ever heard of. You can track how many times people visit their kettle. And all of the data, all of the data from this goes to a cloud platform, goes to what's called the Minder network, and is fed into their clinical care in really close collaboration with local social care teams and social workers. And this is driven by artificial intelligence. So that's a really interface between social care, medical care, fundamental neuroscience, and AI.
I ask you to draw your remarks to a
Yes,
wrap up.
sorry. I could talk all day. Sorry, that's what you get for a professor. So this is the last slide. Well, I think you can help neuroscience. All three of these things that I've talked about today, policymakers and learned societies play critical roles in this. We need access to the best minds and international collaborative funding. Uncertainty over visas and things like that hit our sector hard. We, of course, as I talked about, would like to boost our funding into parity with other fields in biomedical sciences. And we'd like your help accelerating the neurotechnology research and spreading public health messages. So this is just my contact details here, and I know my colleagues in BNA would be happy to answer any questions if we don't get to them tonight. Even though it's not a scientific talk, I have to thank my team and all of the neuroscientists around the UK doing this fundamental research. And then I will be quiet. I really look forward to hearing Anne and Matt.
Tara, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we continue to listen to you. But we do to get through. Just one question from me about this funding. You're on funding for dementia. You said it's pounds for every £10. Sorry, 8 pence for every £10 of cost. Is that a figure that's been going up, or is it a figure that's been going down? And presumably, along with the research you're doing, there also need to be longitudinal studies and monitoring people who perhaps got a family history of dementia, see what happens. Because actually, if you once got it, it's too late. The damage from potentially 20, 40 years. So I'd just be interested in a couple of sentences in that.
Yeah, I'll try and be brief. It's going up. Thank you. Because those numbers that I showed you were from a few years ago when one of the latest censuses was run, but because of the commitments to increase dementia funding, because of the big commitment from both government and charity to the UK Dementia Research Institute, for example, those numbers are getting better. So thank you, but they're still nowhere near where I think we need to be. You won't be surprised to hear. And absolutely, longitudinal studies are important and biomarkers are important because the brain is changing for decades before you have symptoms in dementia. And we think the time to intervene is before the symptoms. So you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of work going on in that sphere.
Brilliant. Thank you. I'm now going to over to our, I'm going to hand over to Anne Cook, who is Chief Executive of the British Neuroscience Association, who is going to have a chat with Matt Eagles. I'm going to leave it to you, Anne and Matt, to monitor your own time. So please try and keep it to around 10-minute mark. If it gets absurdly over, I will try and but I'll leave that because I don't want to stall the discussion. So with that, over to you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That's a very dangerous thing to say with Matt on the screen.
Yes, I'll do my best not to go over time.
So I'm delighted to have this opportunity of having a lovely chat with Matt Eagles. So Matt is a friend of the BNA and of neuroscience, and we just wanted to really take the opportunity in today's session to not only talk about, I suppose, the academic side of neuroscience research and the important work that Tara's been describing, but to really illustrate that this is ultimately people, and that's what we all want to do, is to improve people's lives. And I think Matt is a great example of how that can happen, how neuroscience research can have a real life benefit. So I'm going to ask Matt a few questions, and we'll just see where that takes us. It's always fun with Matt. But I am going to start off with a question. I started, when I suggested how we would kick off, I wanted to ask Matt just to describe what his life might be like without any treatments and without any kind of neuroscience research informing his care. And he shared a video with me. Now, Matt, do you want me to play that video first?
Yes, you can do, yeah.
I'm just going to share my screen. Just bear with me for a moment. And then we're going to look at a short video of Matt.
This is Parkinson's in the raw.
Mm-hmm. So this plays for about a minute. I'm just going to let it run.
It's quite hard hitting, but it's something that happens to me every day, more or less. It's not the fact that I don't really like super noodles, which happen to be on that plate. But the feeling is like having cutlery in your hand that is exactly the polar opposite to my food. And every time I try and go near it with my cutlery, it kind of bounces off. So I was going to say, when I'm like that, I cannot do anything at all. I can't read, I can't hold a book, I can't type on a computer. Foolishly, I shave with a razor. Can you imagine trying to shave? Honestly, every single aspect of my daily life is affected by my Parkinson's.
I think that comes across very strongly in that video, and thank you for sharing that, Matt, because it must be quite it's opening up your life to other people, but I think it really does bring home how frustrating it must be.
Absolutely. It's so important to sort of share that it isn't just the shakes. There are over 40 different symptoms with people with Parkinson's disease, ranging from tremor, from slowness of gait, through to apathy, through to depression, fatigue, sleep disorders, which are totally unknown.
Mm-hmm. Can you describe a bit about what treatments you are taking which help you to manage the Parkinson's disease?
Yeah, I certainly can. And without them, I have to say, I wouldn't be able to speak to you guys right now. I don't know whether you can see, I'm actually battery powered. So, and I've got my charge on. So, when people go on holiday to recharge their batteries, well, I actually do that 20 minutes every single day. And I'm remote controlled as well. That is my remote. So only I use that, because otherwise you could get like a mad puppeteer or puppet master. And I'd be like Wallace and Gromit in the wrong trousers going out all over the place. But the reality is, this deep brain stimulation that I had 15 years ago has absolutely changed my life around. Basically, I have 2 electrodes which go deep into my skull, and they're attached by a wire that goes down behind my ear. And I'm not going to, I don't know whether you can see that. It's essentially like having a brain pacemaker, but it's enabled me to photograph the 2012 Olympics, and it's enabled me to carry on my life. I wouldn't say as normal, whatever normal is, but it's enabled me to participate and contribute to society in a very positive way.
I think that's a really important message as well. It's not just about, Tara mentioned, although saving lives is important, it's also about living lives, isn't it, and living a full life. And how the
quality of life is essential. It really is.
And are you able to say anything about, because I know that you've had various kind of drug therapies as well.
Yeah. I've had intravenous apomorphine, which was interesting. It helped, but it's not ideal to have a needle in your side all throughout the day. There were various sort of effects that it had on me that weren't particularly pleasant. It caused me to suffer from extreme startle, which didn't help very much when I was working in a telephone sales environment. So my coffee would end up over my trousers after about 2 minutes of every single day. But it did work. There are lots of therapies, but I think the drug therapy that's worked the most, and I'm still on, bearing in mind, I've been diagnosed since 1975, guys. I've lived with Parkinson's for it was on my birthday, 7th of November, according to my digital health records. So on my 7th birthday, it was put down Parkinson's disease. Now, the average onset age is about between 60 and 70, I believe. So that's very unusual. However, I do consider myself extremely lucky because I have no other life to compare it to. I've been through education, I've been through university, and I've always worked, by the way. So all of these experiences for me have been done with Parkinson's.
Mm-hmm.
So
I was one of my other questions was to ask how your life had changed as a result of having these treatments. And again, you shared another video with me, really short.
Yes.
I'm just going to bring that one up as well, which I think, again, kind of sums things up quite nicely. So I'm just
I do like to challenge myself, and I encourage everybody else to do the same in whatever way you find fit. But this is certainly one where I like to challenge myself. And also raise money for Parkinson's UK. Now, you may not believe it, but I am actually stood on the top of that plane, waving at everybody in Gloucestershire. And it's one of the most thrilling experiences I've ever had in my life. But that is only down to the fact that I've had deep brain stimulation, which is one of the most important clinical therapy areas for neurological disorders. And it shows amazing potential, not just for clinical neuroscience research into Parkinson's, but also for stroke and neuropsychiatric disorders, which, I mean, I never used to be able to speak as well as I'm doing at the moment. And that is down to DBS, deep brain stimulation, and a bit of elocution because my mother didn't like my Mancunian accent when I was little, which is sad but true. But I cannot stress enough how important neuroscience is. I really can't. It's got the potential to unlock the mysteries of the human mind, to help us understand the importance of mental wellness, which is so crucial to everyday living. It also helps people communicate better with each other, to empathize and listen to one another. And it also empowers people to invest in their own health. I think I've actually gone before the question you were going to ask last time, but I think neuroscience gives hope where there's previously been none. And certainly with me, without neuroscience, I really wouldn't be speaking to you here right now.
Thank you so much, Matt. You're right. I don't need to ask the questions. You, in yourself, I think you're just such an advocate for neuroscience research. Huge thank you for sharing that with us today. I hope that's kept things to time for you, Stephen, but if I can hand over to you now.
Thank you.
And thank you very much. Yes, very good on time. And Matt, thank you for sharing your story with us. absolutely fascinating. And I think you said you'd had deep brain stimulation 15 years ago. Is that right?
Yes, 2006, September 2006.
And has that, presumably you haven't had the answer, if you like, changed in now, but has the technology around that changed? And have you seen further
yes, it's improving all the time. When I first had it, my device that I used to control it wasn't a digital device. This is so smart, and without it, actually, I wouldn't be able, because before it's programmed correctly, I couldn't move at all. That's how. I mean, I was in pain. I couldn't even crawl on the floor, and that seems quite remarkable looking at me now. But that's just with neuromodulation of my brain. And I say the applications are phenomenal for depression, for migraine, for mental health, and it's the science through these guys at the British Neuroscience Association and around the world. This is improving exponentially. And we can't afford not to fund it. It just can't.
That message is coming across loud and clear. Again, and thank you to you, Matt, and for keeping time, and of course, thank you to Anne for asking the questions. Right, we will move on to our next speaker, which is Tim Condino. Tim, I think you're going to talk to us about how neural interfaces are beginning to impact human health. Tim, we very much look forward to hearing what you have to say. 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank Anne and Matt for such a wonderful motivation before my talk. What I would like to talk about are electronic device technologies as alternatives to pharmacological interventions, such as deep brain stimulation. I'm working at Imperial College London, and I'm also part of the UK Dementia Research Institute. And all my work is in the area of developing electronic device technologies for neuroscience applications. And so, first of all, I just want to define what is a neural interface. I define this as the direct connection of technical components to the brain or more generally to the nervous system. And these can be used to restore a lost function, or even in the future, perhaps enhancement. And these could really transform medicine, but more broadly, they might be applied to even non-medical applications. And so just before the pandemic, the Royal Society sanctioned this perspective called Ihuman, which really explored the space of neural interfaces. And they looked at what technology is available today, what could be coming in the future, posed a few ethical questions, and they made recommendations for UK calls to action. And so this resource is available online freely, and it really unpacks the whole field. The web address is here. And so this perspective tried to catalog the different types of neural interfaces that are out there, both in healthcare and actual clinical applications, but also in research. And so if we look at the breadth of neural interface technologies that are out there, on the left we have the non-invasive technologies, so wearable devices, and on the right we've got the invasive technologies, which are the implantable devices, such as deep brain stimulation. And so these span from kind of scanners and headsets that we wear to electrodes that are implanted deep into the brain. So what do these technologies actually look like? So on the left here, we've got some wearable neural interface technologies. So on the top are consumer devices for for observing activity in the brain. We've got, this is a clinical EEG recording. We've got TENS devices to help with pain. And this is an fMRI scanner for imaging activity in the brain during activities. On the right, we've got what implantable technologies look like. So here we've got a device for epilepsy. On the bottom, there's a device for chronic pain. This is a cochlear implant. And on the top here, we've got a brain machine interface. So this is for reading out control signals for people, for example, that might be paralyzed or locked in. And so to look at a few kind of medical successes that are out there in neural interfaces. So starting from diagnostics, EEG, which is this headset-like sensors, ECOG, which is a minimally invasive version of EEG, where electrodes are put down on the surface of the brain, and fMRI is functional, like an MRI scanner. These technologies are used for assessing brain function, in planning any type of surgery for epilepsy, in any type of brain injury, or in assessing sleep disorders. Assistive technologies exist as well in the wearable space, so things like TENS for pain relief. There are stimulation technologies for motor control or for controlling wheelchairs. And in the implantable space, I want to give 3 examples. So cochlear implants is currently one of the most widespread implantable neural interfaces in use today. There's currently around 750,000 in use worldwide. We've heard about the huge impact of deep brain stimulation, currently around 200,000 in use, and spinal cord stimulation for chronic pain, again, of the order of 100,000 devices in use. So I then want to, we've seen what's out there. So what are the remaining challenges and what are the opportunities for the future? So to start off with, neural interfaces are generally based on electrode-based technologies. So this means that a conductive material like a metal needs to be in touch either with the skin or with tissue. And with that comes some challenges, the challenges of what we call selectivity or resolution, scalability, or how well we can interface with many neurons. For example, the brain, as you heard, has of the order of 100 billion neurons. A lot of neural interfaces, they use of the order of tens or maybe hundreds of electrodes. So we've got many, many orders of magnitude more signals than we can observe. And stability, we need to make sure that these neural interfaces work day in, day out, over years and over decades. And so there's a lot of activity on the engineering front on actually addressing these challenges. On the therapeutic front, a lot of these therapies are actually open loop, so they work like pacemakers. So it's like a clock therapy. So they don't actually adapt to what the person is doing. And so this means that there might be some what we call off-target effects and side effects. So for example, like deep brain stimulation, it might currently address a tremor, but it might also cause some other challenges, for example, sleep disturbance or other challenges. And so I think this is why neuroscience research is so fundamental, because a lot of the underlying mechanisms are not still fully understood. And really being able to sense something and intervene adaptively would really be transformative, even for deep brain stimulation therapies, which are having so much impact. And thirdly, currently our application of neural interfaces are very limited to a few application spaces. We're looking at movement disorders, things like Parkinson's, dystonia, essential tremor, and then sensory impairment, so profound deafness. But as we develop better disease models through our neuroscience research, we really will be able to apply more broadly and really tackle things like dementia, mental health, and other applications. And so next, I want to very quickly go through some technologies that are emerging. So one area, as I've mentioned, is that of closed loop systems. So can we sense something that's happening in the brain or in the nervous system and adapt and respond kind of as an intervention rather than as a pacemaker-based intervention? The second area is that of bioelectronic medicine. So the nervous system is much more than just the brain. It's also our autonomic and our peripheral nervous system. And there are opportunities to intervene through the autonomic or the peripheral nervous system for conditions that aren't necessarily always associated with the nervous system. So, for example, inflammation, different types of autoimmune diseases, rheumatoid arthritis. These are all targets for electronic interventions that interface with the autonomic nervous system. And that there is kind of a lot of activity in the UK in this space. There's a large effort by Galvani to develop these types of devices. Also in the implantable space, there's what are known as brain-machine interfaces. There's a lot of kind of high-profile efforts out there. So there's Paradromics, there's BlackRock Neurotech, and there's Neuralink. So different kind of commercial entities looking at creating interfaces to the brain to be able to detect activity, decode something useful and using it to control or to communicate with something. And in the wearable space, again, wearable devices, efforts out there are looking at other ways of interfacing or other modalities beyond just standard electrical connections that are currently available. So one approach that Facebook or Control Labs are taking are to use muscle signals as biological amplifiers to neural signals to be able to, as a way of reading out intention. And Kernel is another company that's looking at using very fast pulsed light as a way of measuring activity in the brain, trying to improve that selectivity and the sensitivity of conventional neural interfaces. So this is just a snapshot of a rapidly increasing industry. And so this is kind of, so this is showing the neurotech industry, all the investment to the neurotech industry and hubs of research. And so if I had shown this slide 5-10 years ago, there would have been only a few tens of companies out there. And so this is a massively expanding field. And this industry is really underpinned by advances in neuroscience. And so this brings me to, I think, my second to last slide. And so even though a lot of the time we are focused on the science and technology, we also need to think about the healthcare economics in order to make things work and to create technologies that really have impact. And so there are ethical implications, and through the KTN, networks have been created in the UK to explore how we can bring together industry, academia, and government. And so just some very quick take homes. So firstly, both science and technology are needed. So the neuroscience is essential. The technology can help the neuroscience, but then the neuroscience can help new medical interventions and impact to human health. We can improve existing therapies, or we can really go after kind of the big problems of society: stroke, neurodegeneration, mental health. We don't currently have many effective interventions. And in order to do this, it's really essential to establish this ecosystem. So bringing together science, technology, the business aspect, the healthcare, but also the ethical and legal framework. Thank you.
Tim, thank you very much indeed. Some fascinating insights there to the work you and others have been doing. I am aware apparently that I have an echo on my audio. I did leave the meeting beforehand and I'm rejoining, but we couldn't get rid of it. So apologise for that to everybody. Tim, I was very interested. I mean, it's certainly on the invasive technology. It's not really an area where you can do a lot of trial and error, implanting into the nervous system of people's brains. Is the underlying technology therefore sensing which parts of the brain are stimulated, asked to do a certain task, then sort of target that very gently to see if you can then develop something that will have a real meaningful impact, such as we saw with the deep brain implants. I'm just interested in the process one goes through to get a new technology, to get a new therapy.
Yeah, but I mean, there are several kind of methodologies of testing. I mean, kind of the regulatory kind of framework requires you to demonstrate safety and efficacy. So you need to be able to demonstrate things are safe. And so we use kind of, I mean, there are different animal models that we can use for testing safety. There are kind of in silico models, so we're able to simulate certain things. And I think we build upwards. So we start off from it might be using tissue samples or using animal models to demonstrate safety, and then after we demonstrate safety, then we can go to first in human trials. So the safety is paramount.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. And just to remind everyone, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we're coming to those short after we have heard from our final speaker. So thank you again, Tim. But our final speaker, Professor Masood Bain. Masood, if we could have 10 minutes from you, that would be great. Are we there?
Masood, I think you're muted.
Yeah, you are. So I won't start the clock. If you want to go back and can just reintroduce yourself.
I was actually just saying thank you for the invitation. So you didn't miss very much. But I wanted to focus on two things really: aging and dementia, which are two areas that have been identified in terms of healthcare challenges in the UK government's life sciences vision. That's aging and neurodegeneration more broadly. That includes Parkinson's as well as Alzheimer's and many other types of dementia. And I wanted to start by showing the data that neuroscientists have collected over the decades, which show that as we age, unfortunately for most of us, what happens is there is a decline across many cognitive domains. So here is perceptual processing speed in green. Then we've got various things like reasoning, spatial functions, verbal memory, verbal ability. All of these things, unfortunately, on average, tend to decline as we age, and that's in the normal population. The interesting things are really about people who go beyond that normal trajectory. And as neurologists, we recognize something called mild cognitive impairments. In other words, where there are cognitive deficits which are worse than normal aging, but they don't necessarily have any functional impact on everyday life. On the other hand, dementia is really defined by cognitive deficits which do have a significant impact on people's everyday function. That's how we define dementia. And it's interesting that if we looked at the numbers of cases of mild cognitive impairment that are estimated to be occur de novo in the UK, it's nearly of the order of 500,000 per year. And if we look at the number of new cases of dementia in the year, we're talking really of the order of over 200,000 per year. And of course, as Tara alluded to, this has a huge cost in terms of healthcare, but also in terms of patients and families. It's a huge burden for all of them and the NHS. So apart from tracking what happens with aging, what has neuroscience actually been able to do? And I think one of its biggest assets has been uncovering some of the mechanisms which seem to be occurring as people normally age, and also with abnormal neurodegeneration. So these are the molecular, cellular, also to some extent genetic mechanisms which might lead to neurodegeneration. And one of the key findings has been that many conditions which lead to the brain degenerating are associated with proteins that are aggregating within the brain. For example, here in Alzheimer's disease under the microscope, you can see that there are these abnormal proteins, amyloid and tau, which are aggregating. In Parkinson's disease, there's a different type of protein, alpha-synuclein, which is aggregating. So that's been important in identifying the causes of neurodegeneration or the associations of neurodegeneration across many different diseases. And in addition, an important contributor to neurodegeneration is what's happening to the blood supply to the brain and the pathology affecting the blood vessels, including the very small blood vessels and their effects on cognitive function. So we've uncovered some of the molecular, cellular mechanisms that are going on in the brain as we age, and when it goes through an abnormal trajectory and leads to neurodegeneration. And the difficulty is trying to link that pathology seen in the brain post-mortem with what actually happened in terms of neural function when someone was alive, and ultimately to relate that to how brains shrink, how neurons are lost. And on a different scale, we can use brain imaging to look at how brains are changing over time. So these are kinds of composites of scans of many hundreds of patients, people, as they age. So this is what the volume of the cerebral cortex is doing as we age. This is one particular important region in the brain, the hippocampus, which is very important for memory. And you can see that actually there's a very strong inflection point around the age of 60 when things begin to decline in terms of the size of the hippocampus. So these are the ways in which at different levels of scale, all the way from molecules to brain imaging, neuroscience has been able to contribute to understanding what's happening in normal aging and neurodegeneration. And innovatively, I think it's been able to take that one step further. It's been able to take the pathology. For example, we know these amyloid proteins are aggregating in brains of patients with Alzheimer's disease, and take it to scanning such patients while they're still alive. And here I'm going to try and show you a little video of someone who is scanned with a special type of scanning technique called positron emission tomography. And in this case, the amyloid in the brain is labeled, and we can see how that amyloid is accumulating years before the diagnosis of dementia occurs. So this is now 25 years before the diagnosis, and just watch what happens in terms of the amyloid load as it increases in the brain. Now we're at 18 years before the diagnosis of dementia. We've got to 10 years, 5 years. And this is the point where the diagnosis of dementia comes in. And the important point here is that we can see that processes are occurring in life 2 decades before the diagnosis occurs. And that just wouldn't have been possible without the innovation of finding out what the proteins were in the brain that were deposited in Alzheimer's disease, defining a new way to do this scan and showing that you can follow people up longitudinally. Okay, but cognitive decline isn't absolutely inevitable. Not everybody does this. So although some people, most of us do decline, there are people who can maintain their resilience to whatever's happening within the brain in terms of pathology. And the question that's really important here is, how come some people can be resilient to these changes occurring in the brain? You can look at some individuals who have lots of amyloid in their brains when they died, but they never showed dementia. So this is one of the real interesting paradoxes about why some brains are more resilient than others. So as Tara said, those neuroscientists who work in population health have shown us that lifestyle factors are really crucial. Blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, obesity, all increase the risk of dementia, but they really do that in midlife, in your 40s and 50s. That's when the interventions need to occur, because as we've seen, the changes are occurring 2 decades before someone comes to clinical presentation. But why is it that some people are resilient? Why are some brains resilient and seem to preserve cognitive health and others don't? And these are sort of fundamental questions that we really do need to answer as a community, as a country, if we're going to have an impact in terms of understanding neurodegeneration and make an impact on the world stage. And as my colleagues have suggested and shown you, we've got the tools to investigate and answer these questions, all the way from the level of molecules to brain imaging in people in life. But it's the investment in this area that really needs crucial thinking about in terms of priorities and where we're going with this. And perhaps we can discuss this in the Q&A as well. So thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I was fascinated by it. It's a question that has puzzled me for a little while, which is that you do need to, you can see the start of dementia potentially 2 years before the actual diagnosis. Would there be an argument for screening people at a younger age using the imaging technology, perhaps then delivering lifestyle advice and potentially treatment that could slow the progress if you can start to see the changes that you were identifying, or because this resilient brain issue, actually you'd be treating lots of people who didn't necessarily need it because they would have a resilient brain. So it's really, is there something to be said? At least if we were screening, then it would put the whole subject sort of more front and center for younger people who can make alternative choice potentially.
Yeah, I think there is a good argument for screening, but the problem is screening with the kind of scanning I've shown you there is immensely costly. There are very few centres in the UK that can do that kind of scanning, and it's, I think, probably at the moment prohibitive. But what is coming into play in the next few years is that those proteins I was talking about, amyloid and tau in the brain, can now also be measured in the blood. And the evidence is accumulating that that could be just as good as some of the imaging that I've shown you. Now, if you take that into 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and you're screening with a blood test, which may be of the order of £50, then you've got something much more, I think, viable in terms of intervening. But of course, it still doesn't answer your second question. I mean, even if they were positive, how do we identify the people who are most likely to be vulnerable in terms of the long term? And that's a kind of question that neuroscience really needs to answer. That's what we, so I've shown you some success stories, but actually there are lots of things we don't understand.
Thank you. Can I thank all of our speakers, Tara, Matt, and Tim, and if we were here in person, we'd do a huge round of applause and say thank you much for your contributions, and then go on to questions. We are going to do. Our first question is going to come from our Vice President, Viscount Stansgate. Stephen, good evening, welcome, thanks for joining us. Please, far away.
Well, hi, I'm sorry to have been a bit late and missed the beginning, but I wanted to ask what I hope isn't too difficult a question. Can some of the speakers tell us a bit more about some of the ethical challenges involved in these areas of research in the years to come? And can you say something about the work that's being done, I believe, in Boston on brain research, that is where the Americans are clearly putting in a huge effort, and also something about the Chinese, who are also devoting a lot of resources, as I understand it, to this area, and where it is said some of the ethical challenges that might prevent researchers in the West from proceeding in certain ways might not carry the same prohibitive force in other parts of the world. Is there something you could tell us about the ethical challenges in the work you're doing?
Thank you for that, Stephen. Would anyone like to some of those points?
I could kick
Tara.
off briefly if you like.
Thank
Yeah, so since I moved from Boston to Edinburgh, I have a little bit of an insight there. In terms of ethical challenges, there are many, as with any branch of science. So, for example, we were raising here with Masood and Stephen the idea of should we treat people who might be in the early stages of dementia when they might not? There are ethical challenges with our animal research, which is absolutely key to understanding brain function, but comes with its ethical difficulties. So we work very closely. In fact, neuroethics is a field now. So there are people helping us navigate these difficult questions. And in terms of what's going on in the States, there's lots going on all over the world. That's one point I didn't get across in 10 minutes, is that neuroscience is international, it's global. And we do have collaborations and we work together closely with people all over the world. And you're right, sometimes these ethical differences in regulation can be sticky. Maybe I'll pass on to Masood, who'll have or any of the other speakers will have a better handle on some of the other aspects.
Masood?
Yeah, I mean, this is an important area. I mean, all the way from the animal research, including non-human primates, which have been fundamental to our understanding not only of neuroscience, but also diseases. You could argue that there are all sorts of considerations there in terms of the difficulties of doing those sort of experiments and the ethics of doing those experiments, all the way to deep brain stimulation, you know, putting something in someone's head in order to try and improve a condition. It didn't all happen, you know, beautifully well right from the beginning. There would have been issues in terms of all the difficulties of trying to optimize the treatment. So there are always going to be caveats to any of these things in terms of where we've got to. But I think in general, the neuroscience community has been very ethical in the way it's conducted itself. It's very transparent. I'm not sure we'd be in a good position to talk about what's going on in China that you are particularly concerned about there.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if anyone else wanted to comment. Tim or Anne, Matt. No, in which case we will move on. Thank you for that. The next question comes from Peter Lilford. Peter, I think someone will mute you, and then please ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Fascinating. You talked though mostly about chronic disease and neurodegeneration. I wanted to ask a specific question about accidental or catastrophic brain damage, such as car accidents, strokes, etc. In these conditions, we can at least now map which bits of the brain are being affected. Do you think it's possible that you'll be able to repair these injuries by stem cell implantation or any other technique in the foreseeable future?
Who would like to comment on that?
I can take that on. I mean, there would be huge challenges to doing that in someone with traumatic brain injury or stroke. And stem cells are only one of the ways in which people are thinking of doing that. As Tim mentioned, there might be devices in which case, you know, there may be electrical ways, stimulation techniques of trying to improve someone's condition who's had a stroke, for example. These things are being looked at. So stem cells are probably the highest level of ambition one could go to in terms of thinking of repair. But there are other ways in between which might lead to more symptomatic improvement. And, you know, trying to rewire a brain which has been damaged from traumatic brain injury, for example, would be a huge undertaking to consider how that would occur. So I think that would be a long-term aspiration, Peter. But in terms of, more shorter-term aspirations, there are ways in which people can improve the quality of patients' lives in terms of symptomatic treatment.
Yes, I thought you might say that, but a big challenge is always a good one. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Matt, yes, please.
Can I just add to that? The amazing transformation, certainly the deep stimulating parts of my brain make. I mean, it's phenomenal. Literally, if I was to turn on different settings, I literally would not be able to move. So if you stimulate the right parts of the brain, there is definitely, I think, potential for chronic brain injuries, because literally I can go from not being able to move at all to be like I am now, which is not perfect, but nearly perfect. So there is a lot of hope.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Matt. And I think, yes, you're demonstrating that for us very clearly. So we are very grateful. I skipped one of our questioners, which is Doug Marriott. Doug, I think you've got a couple of questions, and then I've got an anonymous attendee, which I can't find in the list. So, but the question is quite interesting, so I will ask it just so that we can hear the answer. Doug.
Thank you very much. Most fascinating presentation. Well, thank you. I've a couple of interests really. Is generally the research commercially motivated, or is it in contrast socially funded by government and academia? Is my first question. And my second question, which has been partly answered because I asked it before the message, before the information was provided, but does, I'll change it slightly, does mental degeneration exist in all candidates? Or are there examples where cognitive perception increases with age? Or has any isolated examples been aware that cognitive perception increases with maybe experience statistically, or is that work probably not proven? Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Who would like to venture a view on that?
I can take this on if you want. Yeah, I mean, most of the research is not commercially motivated, and so most of the funding that most neuroscience researchers are getting are either from governments or charities or institutions run by governments. So that's one thing. And to answer your second point, there is one thing that generally tends to get better in all of us, and you could call it wisdom if you like, but it's really about semantic knowledge and understanding things which are not dependent in the same way as episodic memories, which is what we call it. So knowledge of the world tends to actually improve in people as they get older, even if other things are getting worse. So let's call it wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the anonymous attendee, unless you want to stick your hand up right a second, was it on Palmer? Actually, no, okay. No, the question was, and I think it was Tara who touched upon this. The question says, disease disorders of the brain are impacting more and more of us. So why isn't the research funding in place? A good question. Surely it's a problem which will only get worse, affecting more and more of us. But I think, Tara, you said, actually, we are more aware of it. There are more people suffering, but the incidence maybe per 100,000 is lower than it was West. Is that right? Or did I misunderstand what you're saying?
That's correct. Some of the new data suggests that for a given person or for the population, your risk is going down slightly, and we think that's because of the public health and the taking better care of our hearts. People like Masood, neurologists, tend to say to me, what's good for your heart is good for your brain, and that helps prevent things like dementias. In terms of why don't we have adequate funding, like you mentioned, the funding is creeping up, and I would say that it works. So I used cancer as an example, and I wasn't trying to bash the cancer research field or say they should get less money, because if you think back to when I was a kid, diagnoses of cancer were often terminal, right? And now there are many more treatments and hopeful options. Like Matt says, there is hope if we get the funding in place, and we are working hard. So yeah, I think we are still short of what would be useful, but I would say that as a neuroscientist.
Excellent, thank you. If anyone else wants to pass any further comment? No, in which case we'll move on to my colleague, Carol Moynihan. Carol, I think we'll be unmuted. There we are.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi. Yeah, we hear you.
Right, sorry, I was talking into the void there. Thanks very much, Stephen. It'll be no surprise that I want to pick up on the photonics and optics aspect of it, and the technology that we can use. And I think it was Timothy that was talking about using photonic systems to sort of map brain activity and sort of neural activity. And I'm just wondering how accurately we can pinpoint that activity. And would this be used to maybe treat, or is it a diagnosis of brain injuries, or is it to do with degenerative diseases, or what exactly are the applications of that?
In terms of optical technologies, I mean, optical technologies are used quite widely in neuroscience research, but in kind of translational efforts, the example I gave shines light through the skin, and it works like a pulse oximeter. So when you go to a hospital and they put this clip on your finger to measure blood oxygenation, it works by the same principle, and it gets blood oxygenation with on the surface of the brain as an indicator of the amount of activity in different portions of the brain. So that's how non-invasive optical technologies are currently trying to interface with observing neural activity. In neuroscience, we have new techniques, for example, optogenetics, which enable us to target specific cell types so that we can modulate the activity of different cell types, and they can help us interrogate neural circuits to understand both from a basic science perspective, but also in understanding different disease models. And these tools over the last decade have really kind of transformed neuroscience research. So optics and optical tools are having impact, both in science and translational efforts exist also.
Are we still, Timothy, at the developmental stage of these kind of technologies? Will we see more work being done in these?
I think in tools for neuroscience, I think that they are being used, and they are furthering our understanding. So they are having impact scientifically. In translational efforts, in terms of technologies that will impact human health, I think there are trials using techniques such as optogenetics. I am aware of a trial that's used optogenetics as a part of a retinal implant to interface with the retina of participants that have lost their sight. So there are ongoing trials, but I think, yes, they are in a developmental stage. But we're seeing more and more activity.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks, Carol. Okay, we will move on to our next questioner, which is Annette Dolphin, who I think, again, the question's for you, Tim. Annette, are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Thank you so much, everybody, for your really interesting talks. Really brings it home how important basic science is in all of these clinical applications. So my question was specifically for Tim, whether you think that the development of all the devices that you talked about are underpinned by years of basic neuroscience research. I was thinking, for example, of something that was in the news recently. I think they were using striatal stimulation for very severe depression, and the effects were remarkable. Could you say a bit about that and what the basic research was that sort of led them to do that experiment or use that technique on a patient?
Unfortunately, I don't know the specifics of that intervention for depression, but generally, yes, basic science is essential, and all translational efforts start with basic science. So I think in order for us to get to the point of doing pilot trials, we kind of lean on years of basic science research. So I think all translational efforts do start off with basic science. I don't know if any of the other panelists know any specifics about the depression example.
Yeah, I think it was recording from a region of the brain called the amygdala, which is very important in sort of emotion processing. And they wouldn't even have gone there, Annette, if all that fundamental work on understanding fear and in terms of negative emotions hadn't come from originally rodent work and then, primate work. So I think you're absolutely right. It underpinned the reason why they decided to do it this way. And going back to the question about ethics, of course, it's taking a risk doing it this way, but in this case, it worked out. But again, very much dependent on decades of fundamental neuroscience beforehand.
Thank you very much. And I guess that particular patient was really disabled, and so that was one of the things that led to them doing something.
Thanks. Matt, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, just super quickly. The surgical techniques, and I'm no surgeon, but I know for a fact they have come on in leaps and bounds as well, certainly in deep brain stimulation. When I had my surgery nearly 15 years ago, I was in hospital for nearly 3 weeks. Nowadays, the surgery can be done in like a couple of days. So, I mean, that is a huge difference to the costs involved, and it's coming down all the time. So I just wanted to make that point. Say I'm not a surgeon, but I do know that the surgical times are coming down all the time.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. Right, we'll move on to our next question now. It's from Father Bothonga, I believe, if I pronounced that correctly, and please correct me if I haven't.
Oh yes, sorry. It's Paja. I just wanted to say thank you for your presentation, and I would just like to ask if anybody to answer and touch on it. If there are any future plans in focusing funding, increasing the proportion of ethnic minority research. I know Todd touched on the dementia moonshot strategies, but particularly in dementia, we know that ethnic minorities, particularly Black African and Black Caribbean, are at an increased risk of getting a dementia diagnosis and even having a worse prognosis. And I know as well, Professor Timothy, you touched on the invasive and non-invasive technologies that are being devised, but some of them that we know, like the EEG, can't be used on people with coarse hair. And so I just want to know your thoughts if there's any future funding focuses to increase our knowledge, and particularly in genome-wide association studies as well, so that the UK can really be a forefront in these research areas for everyone affected by these diseases.
Thank you very much. Who would like to make some comments around that?
I could start. I know Anne can talk about the fantastic work that BNA is doing as well, but it is a really important issue. Thank you for raising that, Paja. We have become aware very aware over the past few years, not only in neuroscience, but more broadly, of the need for more inclusion and diversity. And it works on multiple levels. So your particular question about dementia is spot on. And there are now large trials that are trying to expand beyond the white European population in terms of genetics. Those are probably, Masood or Tim could jump in if I'm wrong, but I think genetics might be a little bit further advanced than the rest of us in terms of understanding diversity and genetic diversity. There are also active recruitment issues now, or recruitment changes, to try and make sure that the clinical trials that we invest in and recruit people into are diverse and represent the full population. And it's important also for our population-based research. One of the strengths of UK neuroscience is our amazing cohorts. We have fantastic participatory research, but one of the weaknesses of that is it's overwhelmingly white. So there's now thinking happening, but we're not there yet. But it is something that I'm glad you raised, because it is very important across all levels. I've started what we call decolonizing my teaching in neuroscience, and that was with the help of BNA and Anne and the fantastic work that they do.
Thank you for that. Dara, Anne, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, just a small bit to add. As Tara mentioned, we have actually done some work in the BNA, and there's a section on our website called Anti-Racist Neuroscience, which you might be interested to look at. But just anecdotally, I can't kind of comment specifically on any studies or so on, but I would say anecdotally very recently, over the last year or two, conversations that we've had with companies, so in the commercial sector, companies that are doing clinical trials, it has come up in conversation more about they are aware that this is an issue and they want to tackle it. Now, I can't give you any statistics. I don't know how much that's happening, but I would at least say that people and companies are aware of that and are trying to change and improve the situation.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't get it to unmute. Okay, we will move on to our question, which is from Yolanta Jeffrey. Please.
Oh, hello, thanks. Thank you very much for organizing the session and for the contribution, and it's wonderful. I'm a neuroscientist, obviously. My heart leaps up when I hear it, and it's very important when we talk about aging and diseases of old age, etc. But obviously, it's essential to remember that brain starts early in life, and the resilience and cognitive reserve, which give us a chance of better old age and better brain, start very early on. Poverty and deprivation are very important factors that affect human brain very early in life, projecting well into the future in older life. I think it would be wonderful if this session was having a knock-on effect on the, on the politicians. I'm so glad to have Stephen Metcalf in the session, and I really hope that there will be a take-home message which you will take to the Parliament and discuss the very important societal issues, such as inequality and such as the really big need for leveling up really in real life, with a view of brain health, because brain health is about healthy society and healthy economy as well. Thank you. And thank you all. It's really brilliant.
I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, as I think it's probably more of a statement of fact, really, that poverty and deprivation has impact not only on brain health, but also many other life chances. Why I don't want to get political on that sort of meeting, but it is recognised that by trying to get people out of poverty, give them better start in life, better life chances, opportunity, better education, you can improve people's long-term outcome. And I think you ask a further question further down, do politicians take that to account? I think we try to, this is not a simple solution to eradicating deprivation and poverty, but it is something very much that we are conscious and are trying, whether you believe us or not, to take account of and to do our best to, and talked about, level up opportunity across the country. And I don't know if anyone wants to add to that. It was more a critical point, so I thought I should probably try and take that one. No, I don't know if Stephen wanted to comment as another politician on call. Not necessarily, Stephen, unless you want to particularly. You're still muted. I think probably we'll move on if that's okay. Probably time one more question, which is from Danai Dima. Danai?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for a wonderful session. My question has to do, especially in the age of 2021, where we saw the collaboration between AstraZeneca and Oxford. In psychiatry, the last 15 years, we have seen a close down in pharmaceutical companies invest in actually putting any money into psychiatric pharmaceuticals. And do you see any way how we can convince or engage pharmaceuticals, especially psychiatric drugs? And I mean, we were tried that with genetics, and how can, which hasn't been as successful as we hoped in 2011, in 2021, but what is the way to actually convince pharmaceuticals to work together with universities and with public funding so we can create a new AstraZeneca Oxford collaboration, maybe for dementia or for schizophrenia or for depression? How do you see a way forward with that? Or is there a way forward?
I think there has to be a commercial business case to engage pharma in this, because so many pharmaceutical companies have run away from central nervous system diseases, particularly because of the failures in the dementia space, but also, you know, in terms of psychiatry. So more broadly speaking, across neurological and psychiatric disorders, I think pharmaceutical companies are only going to be interested if there is a good business case for doing that. So we need to think about new models for getting them engaged. And that, to some extent, may be happening in the dementia space because of all the failures that have occurred with the drugs that have been developed. It might be better to collaborate in terms of government and pharmaceutical companies taking some of the risks together, or developing tools that might be used more broadly across different pharmaceutical companies. But I think the big answer to your question, Danai, is that we need a new model for doing this.
Thank you. Yeah.
Can I just add very briefly to that?
Please do.
So it is a huge challenge. I think, unfortunately, the history of developing drugs in psychiatry and mental health has been very bumpy. And understandably, that makes it difficult to invest in it as a commercial organisation. I am about to put a link in the chat to an organisation you might be interested in called the Psychiatry Consortium. So that is a consortium of charities and commercial drug companies who are really trying to overcome those challenges and have got some interesting work underway. So that might be something to check out.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think that really brings us to the end of our time for this evening, and I really want to thank, of course, all of our speakers, to Anne and Tara, to Tim, to Mud, and to Matt for their contributions. I think it's been a fascinating discussion covering quite a lot of ground. Of course, thank you as our audience and our questioners for their contribution, and of course to thank the British Neuroscience Association for their pulling together this evening. And of course, none of this would have happened with my team from the Parliamentary and Scientific Committee, from Lee G. Jeffs, thank you, Lee, John Slater and Karen, Ben and Alfie, who will be putting up a report of this evening's discussions for our website, but we will also be publishing an account, various articles relating to this, and this goes back to the point that Jolanta was making about politicians incorporating understanding of neuroscience. We publish a magazine called Science, and that will reference to help inform colleagues from across both houses of the importance of neuroscience. So thank you very much for your contribution in helping us to be able to do that. It's been a very interesting evening. Now, at this point, normally I would tell you about our next meeting, which is scheduled for the 8th November, but I think it's potentially a range of we may yet have to phone it. So rather than waffle and make it up as I go along, what I'm going to say is that at present, there is still a meeting for the 8th of November, but for details will be confirmed from the off in due course. And if we have to postpone it, and it will be because there is a good reason. But I can do something, and if we can, I look forward to seeing you again on Monday, the 8th of November. But until then, thank you all very much. Thank you for your contribution, and I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. Speak to you all again soon. Cheerio.